All right, so as people are trickling in, thank you so much for being here and welcome. I am Lalita Duparan. I'm the Associate Director of the Center for South Asia. And I would just like to start by acknowledging that Stanford is an occupier of the ancestral and unceded land of the Muwekma Ohlone tribe. We are grateful to be guests on this land and commit to solidarity to Indigenous struggles. I'm speaking on behalf of the Director of the Center for South Asia, Professor Anna Bigelow, and I also want to thank our Program Coordinator, Simrat Mataru, and the Office of Spiritual and Religious Life Program Coordinator, Event Coordinator, Diane Abundabar, for their incredible behind-the-scenes work that will continue throughout this event. You may have noticed that we are recording, and we will be recording the panel and the panel discussion, and when we open it up to Q&A, we're going to stop the recording, and so people may feel more free to ask questions and interact with the speakers. So the format for today is that our four guests will each make some remarks, and then Dean Tiffany Steinwert will lead a conversation among the panelists, and then we will open up the virtual floor for Q&A. The original plan had been that the students or the Stanford participants would be together, maybe sharing a meal, creating community, and then Omicron put a stop to that. So we're back to the entirely virtual setting, but we're running this as a meeting, and so that we can all at least have a sense of being together in this space. The chat is open. You can write your questions or comments in the chat anytime. Please be concise and constructive. And then when we get to the audience Q&A part of the teach-in, just feel free to raise your virtual hand by using the reactions at the bottom of your screen. Please don't do that early, just at the end when we say the floor is now open. So it is my very great pleasure to introduce you to our four panelists and our moderator today. And the way I'm going to do it is just before each speaker, I will introduce them. They will make some remarks. It'll come back to me, and then I'll introduce the next speaker. So you don't have to remember 5 people's bios. That was our thinking there. Our first speaker today is Dean Varun Soni. He is the Dean of Religious Life at the University of Southern California. Dean Soni received his MTS degree from Harvard Divinity School and his MA through the Department of Religious Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara. He earned his PhD through the Department of Religious Studies at the University of Cape Town, where his doctoral research focused on religion and popular culture. He is the author of Natural Mystics, The Prophetic Lives of Bob Marley and Nusrat Fateh Ali Khan, which was published in 2014, and he produced a critically acclaimed graphic novel, Tina's Mouth, an existential comic diary by Keshini Kashyap, which is currently being adapted as a feature-length film. Born in India and raised in Southern California, Dean Soni has family on 5 continents, and they collectively represent every major religious tradition in the world. It's so wonderful that you're here with us today, and please start off our session.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that very generous introduction, just like we rehearsed. I appreciate that. Super grateful to everyone who joined us today. I'm very honored to be part of this important conversation with my fellow Hindu chaplains. We don't get to have these kinds of conversations, I would say often, but really ever. And so this is a real gift. Thank you. Thank you for including me. I thought maybe what I would do is just tell my own story about Hindu chaplaincy and begin to see sort of how that might connect with the stories of the other chaplains, and that might lead us into a deeper conversation. And in many ways, it's appropriate that I'm telling this story to you today at Stanford, because in some ways, my story as the Dean of Religious Life at USC is very much connected to the Office for Religious Life at Stanford. My mentor was the former dean of that office, Reverend Scotty McLennan. He was my chaplain and my undergraduate thesis advisor when I was at Tufts. When this office was built in 1996 at USC, we built it based on the model of Stanford. And so our office wouldn't exist in the way it does if not for the office at Stanford. When I got a chance to hire 2 associate deans over my career, maybe one of the most important things I did, I hired both of them from the Stanford Office for Religious Life. And I learned so much every day from the dean currently there, Dean Steinwert, who, I steal from the best. And so I always steal from Tiffany. And so we may be rivals on the football field as USC and Stanford, but we're definitely friends in spiritual life. And this conversation is really emblematic of that. So thank you for that. In many ways, I guess my story begins with the 1965 Immigration and Naturalization Act. I'm very much the child of that act. As many of you know, Indians and Hindus really couldn't immigrate and naturalize as citizens to the United States from between about 1924 and 1965. So my parents were of the first generation to come as Hindu immigrants and have children here. And we were able to sort of be raised as Hindu Americans. In many ways, one of the first generations to be raised as Hindu Americans. And that was both a blessing and a curse. I remember when I was a kid, the fact that we were Indian American, Hindu American, that hyphen between Indian and American or Hindu and American served more as a barrier than as a bridge connecting those identities. It was kind of like an obstacle for reconciling those identities. I remember when I went to India to be with my family, they would always look at me as American. And then I came back to the US to hang out with my friends and they would always look at me as Indian. And I just felt like I was neither here nor there, that I occupied some liminal space that caused quite a bit of psychological dislocation. And because we didn't have a long history in this country, we didn't have any role models really in the public sphere. I had Deepak Chopra, thankfully, and Apu from The Simpsons, and really that was about it. So we were trying to make our way in the world, and we didn't really know where to look for a sense of identity or belonging. I'm fortunate that my grandparents moved in with us when I was really young, and my grandfather became sort of the most important influence in my life as a young age. He raised me because my parents were always working, and so through him, I got connected with a sense of sort of what it meant to be Indian and what it meant to be Hindu. And his mother was very close with Kasturba Gandhi, who was Mahatma Gandhi's wife. So my great grandmother was one of the leaders of the Indian nationalist movement. And so my grandfather kind of grew up around Gandhi, and he used to regale me with stories about his time with him. And in many ways, Gandhi then became this model for what it meant to be Hindu for me. And the movie Gandhi came out at a time where there weren't any depictions of Hindus in popular culture. The same year, I think Gandhi came out, the biggest movie about Hindus in the United States up until that point came out, which was Indiana Jones and the Temple of Doom, where Hindus were, I'm still kind of recovering from that, honestly. I still have PTSD from those depictions. But many children who watched that movie just assumed that that's what those were, who Hindus were. We ate monkey brains and we kidnapped children and we ripped the hearts out of people to sacrifice to a bloodthirsty goddess. And then Gandhi was the exact opposite. And so in many ways, Gandhi becomes my model. And I didn't plan it this way, but Gandhi was a Hindu, an interfaith leader, a lawyer who lived in South Africa and spent his life doing Hindu Muslim work. I became a lawyer, an interfaith leader who lived in South Africa and have spent so much of my career trying to do Hindu Muslim work. So there was a seminal moment where, if not for that relationship with my grandfather and a sort of a figure who I could relate to in Gandhi, I don't know if I would have been able to reconcile that Hindu American identity. I know many of my college friends, high school friends, went through similar struggles. When I went to college, I began to think deeply about what it meant to be Indian. Still, I was looking for a sense of belonging. I was looking for a place to be in the world. And that's where I met Reverend Scotty McLennan, who was the university chaplain there, who had also spent a lot of time in India and who also had a very Hindu-inspired journey and empowered me to think deeply about my life. And so I felt as though this was a bit of an interesting juxtaposition, that here I was learning about my so-called Eastern religious roots at a Western research university. And for many students, including my own, we're heritage students when we come to college. And that may be the first time where we actually get to study our own text, Hindu, Buddhistic texts. Because when I was growing up, I grew up in a sort of secular family. I have 12 physicians in my family. My PhD in religion means nothing to any of them. Even my daughter tells me she wants to be a real doctor like her mother, not like me. The PhD shaming starts early in my family, but I grew up in a secular household. So we celebrated, Diwali, and I had a cultural sense of what it meant to be Hindu, but I didn't know theologically what it meant until I went to college. And that really inspired a journey, especially a journey that allowed me to bring together the spiritual and the scholarly aspects of my life, where I could think of them as two parts of the two sides of the same coin. I ended up going on to do a PhD. I started at UC Santa Barbara, but there I also felt, as a scholar, I also felt a sense of dislocation, because so much of the way we approached Hinduism was through European colonialism and colonial scholarship, and through Western theory, it just didn't work for me. I left my PhD program at UC Santa Barbara and I finished at the University of Cape Town, because I felt like there was a double standard there, and it was really difficult, especially to be a scholar and a practitioner. The scholars thought of you as an apologist, the practitioners thought that you had lost your path or your faith. And once again, I felt a sense of dislocation. So I guess up until this point, my Hindu Americanness was really framed as these oppositional forces, spiritual and scholarly pulling me apart, or Hindu and American pulling me apart. And then in 2008, I saw this job at USC, which was a job for a chaplain of the university, essentially the university chaplain. And what I noticed was that it didn't require me to be Christian. It didn't require me to be ordained. In that way, it was very unique. And it's because USC doesn't have a university church. So my predecessor was Jewish and I could be Hindu. And so I applied for the job. It was 2008. There was a lot of hope and change in the air. Obama had just gotten the nomination for president. And I felt like all the things that had always worked against me, having a funny name, being kind of young, being a little audacious and trying to do things that other people hadn't done, actually worked for me in that one moment. I was just in the zeitgeist at the right time. So I ended up getting this position at USC and became the first Hindu in American history to be the chief religious or spiritual leader of a university. When I got the job, I got a lot of love on campus, but I also got a fair amount of hate. I began to see and read a lot of sort of alums were writing in, sort of telling the university how they'd betrayed the Judeo-Christian roots of the university, and how could an idolater lead anyone in prayer, and we've lost our way, etc. But what I noticed is that all the students were super stoked, and the alums were upset, but those were alums who'd all graduated before 1980. And there was I immediately saw a generational divide between sort of the students I was ministering to or chaplaining versus the students who preceded me on campus. What I noticed was that I even though I was the chaplain who happened to be Hindu, I spoke a lot as the Hindu chaplain on various panels and in interfaith conversations. And I was lonely. I still am lonely. I saw virtually no Hindu chaplains. There were many Indian students that might have been in the audience, but like me, their parents or the culture really pushes them to do something else. There isn't even an idea of chaplaincy within Hinduism. It's very much a Christian idea that's been imported into the tradition. And so even trying to think about what a Hindu chaplain is in many ways an act of invention and reinvention. And so our illustrious panelists are really building this idea in real time. They're doing something that no one has ever done before, and that's extraordinary. And I'm totally inspired by them. While I love the idea that I was the first Hindu chaplain, at some point it began to chafe a little bit on me, because it began to feel as though the way people came up to me or the way I was presented was I got the job because I was Hindu, when in fact I felt like I got the job in spite of the fact that I was Hindu. And I just didn't want to be known as someone who got the job because of this, because of the university wanted to break the mold. I was also a lawyer, and I went to div school, and I had started some businesses. I lived in a Buddhist monastery, and I felt like that devalued the fact that I was actually qualified for the job. It wasn't just that I was a new face at a new time. And so I sort of struggled a little bit with that idea of being the first Hindu, because I wanted to also be the person who had the skills to do the job. And I sometimes saw people dismiss that part. But I've come around. I'm really proud of the fact that I get to represent my community in this way. I'm really inspired by the people who are on this panel, and more than anything, I just love doing the work with students. Even though I never thought I could get a job like this, when I got it, I realized it was the job I always wanted. And many chaplains feel that way, not just me. It's not a job that's on our radar, but when we get it, we're like, oh, this is how I bring together the spiritual and the scholarly, or this is how I bring together my Hindu and American identity, or this is how I do the work of empowering young people in the way that my mentors empowered me. And so I feel extremely blessed to be able to do this work, and grateful to be here with all of you. So thank you.
Thank you so much. What a fantastic start to the event, and already so much to think about. Next is possibly then the next person who became a Hindu chaplain. She will speak to that. Dr. Asha Shipman is the director of Hindu Life at Yale University. She had earned her degrees in ecology and anthropology from the University of Connecticut and joined the Yale University's chaplain's office in 2013. And in 2016, she became the second and only female Hindu chaplain with a full-time university appointment in the United States. In this role, she collaborates with campus organizations on programs that highlight Hinduism and Indian culture and serves as the advisor for the Hindu Students Organization at Yale. Dr. Shipman is a contributor to the first book on Hindu chaplaincy in the United States, entitled Hindu Approaches to Spiritual Care, and also author of an upcoming article on Hindu chaplaincy in the US, published by the Journal of Interreligious Studies. Dr. Shipman, welcome.
Thank you so much. And I want to say that it's such a pleasure to be on this panel. One of the first folks who I spoke with about Hindu chaplaincy actually was Varun, and I remember very fondly that conversation. I felt like I had a shield mate in a way, because we had a lot in common. And I also resonate very much with being of the same generation, right, where parents were coming in as immigrants. But at the same time, I've worked in higher education for a good long time, and I have witnessed the subsequent generations of students coming onto these campuses and the issues that they are grappling with. And I'll talk a little bit about my own personal journey, maybe in the Q&A. But what I wanted to do is, I'm also the chair of the North American Hindu Chaplains Association, and that is the first professional chaplaincy association for Hindu spiritual caregivers in the country. And I'm going to give you a kind of a 30,000 feet view of how we think of chaplaincy. There are very few of us still, and the framing that we use, and then also bring it to ground as the work regarding the work on the university campuses. So that being said, I'm just going to launch into that. So college is a time of personal discernment and identity formation, and students are studying hard and exploring career opportunities. They're participating in non-curricular activities to develop their avocations, and they're establishing friendships and hopefully exploring their spirituality. It is a very tender, exuberant, and sometimes overwhelming time of exploration, and the need for mentors is very important. We hope that their families continue to play a major role in their lives, but away from home, mentors can be professors, coaches, deans, upper level students, and we hope Hindu chaplains. Many people I meet wonder, what is a Hindu chaplain? And from my perspective in higher education, a Hindu chaplain is someone who is professionally trained to offer spiritual care, who has their own spiritual grounding, but whose work is not attached to religious institutions per se. Instead, it is attached to the culture of their university. The spiritual care provided by chaplains centers on the needs and desires of the individual care recipient. While chaplaincy has a strong legacy for the Abrahamic faiths, as Dean Soni mentioned, it is growing for Buddhist communities, and the few of us who are Hindu chaplains are nurturing this profession for our Hindu communities as well. I chair NACA, I mentioned, the North American Hindu Chaplains Association, and NACA offers guidelines regarding defining Hindu chaplaincy. We also offer our own vision of the values and ethics we think Hindu chaplains should ascribe to. I want to share this with you so you can see how it interfaces with the work that we do with our student populations. So in terms of our values, we ground our care on the framework of the Hitaisen, the unbiased friend focused on a person's holistic well-being. We instill in our work our personal commitments to ahimsa, which is non-harm, mentally, physically, emotionally, and spiritually to any care recipient, to dharma, principles and traditions that form the core of our outlook, and a recognition of the inherent diversity and richness of Hindu thought, practice, experience, and culture. we cultivate Shravana, listening, and Manana, reflection, in ourselves and our care recipients, with the goal that they gain resilience and a sense of clarity, meaning, and inner purpose. In this way, we walk alongside our care recipients. The generation now in college is Generation Z, the most ethnically, spiritually, and racially diverse generation in US history. Higher education administrators in the US often present their campuses as secular spaces, but the truth is that stance often ignores or undermines the spiritual and religious identities of our students. Among the many data sources I rely on is Springtide Research Institute, because they focus on Gen Z. And Springtide has found that 71% of Gen Z consider themselves to be at least slightly religious. 61% report an affiliation with a religious institution. And of the 39% who report as unaffiliated, 60% consider themselves at least slightly spiritual. 38 say they are religious, and a smaller percentage actually say they try to live out their religious beliefs in their daily lives. So this is really important to take into consideration when I'm working with students. Also important is to take into account the crisis of mental health across the board in the United States, including our students in the past decade or so. And there's been significant increase in anxiety and depression, along with other mental health challenges reported by the medical field because of the pandemic. So now more than ever, we need trained professionals who can support the mental health and flourishing of our communities, and chaplains are one part of that support network. We know that Generation Z places a high importance on their relationships, and that is where Hindu chaplains can make a huge difference in the life of a college student. Springtide suggests from their research, and I have seen firsthand, that having an influence in a young person's life requires deep listening skills, transparency in what we can and cannot do, and demonstrated integrity and expertise in what we're trying to convey. Springtide calls this relational authority, and you can see that this is closely tied to the values that NACA promotes for Hindu chaplains and spiritual caregivers. Another important fact is that chaplains are less tethered to a religious institution, so students see us as more easily engageable. And why is this important? Again, from Springtide, more than 1 in 4 young people say that they have one or fewer adults they feel comfortable reaching out to when they need help. And nearly 40% say they sometimes feel they have no one to talk to and that no one really knows them well. Hindu parents often hope that the traditions, philosophies, and practices they abide by become integral to their children's present and future self. They definitely hope that in college, their children will have someone who they feel they can trust, who they can talk to when they're troubled, and who can connect them with campus resources when they need them. They and their children, our students, hope they will find a home away from home with a robust community of friends to counter any feelings of alienation or loneliness. And often these students are interested in connecting with their faith in a deeper fashion in their own way. And they benefit from seeing role models demonstrating how to be Hindu and successfully navigate a religiously pluralistic world. Creating a space for all of this represents much of my work as a Hindu chaplain in higher education. Hindu chaplaincy, as Varun mentioned, is very new to the United States. When I began as a Hindu chaplain in 2013, there were only a handful of us in higher education. And since then, we've grown our numbers slightly. The formation of NACA allows us to reach out more. And through opportunities to speak at college campuses like this, we do hope to broaden the message of Hindu chaplaincy and encourage more universities to hire Hindu chaplains. So I will end there.
Thank you so much. Next, I am delighted that we were able to catch in between international travels our next speaker, Raja Gopal Bhattar. They are a higher education leader, advocate, consultant, and author. Previously, Dr. Bhattar served as the Assistant Provost and Executive Director of the Center for Identity and Inclusion at the University of Chicago, overseeing the Office of Multicultural Student Affairs, LGBTQ student life, and student support services, along with campus-wide climate and inclusion work. They hold a PhD and Master of Arts degrees in Higher Education and Organizational Change from UCLA, a Master of Education in Higher Education and Student Affairs Administration from the University of Vermont, and a Bachelor's in Psychology with a minor in Spanish Literature from Boston University. And I first, quote unquote, met Dr. Bhattar when they were speaking at an event maybe 2 years ago now. Vivek was there as well. And have been following you online ever since. I'm fangirling a little bit, and I'm super excited that you're here to be part of this panel. So thank you.
Thank you, Lolita, and thank you for everyone that's organized this space. I'm really just honored to be back in the Stanford community. Namaskar, everyone. My name is Raja, as they said, and I'm currently on Tongva land, also known as Los Angeles. I also want to just recognize that today is the first day of African American History Month, and just want to name how we sit in this space. I did wear my favorite Sandra Oh t-shirt today as a way to celebrate how we show up in this space and how we complicate the conversation. I'm honored to be here with Varun and Asha, just two people that I admire and hold in high regard in this work. So I was deeply fangirling myself when I was asked to be on the panel with these folks. So thank you for the opportunity to be in dialogue. I don't serve as a full-time chaplain doing Hindu work. And so I also really hold this really interesting space to contribute to the conversation today. But I'm really excited. Just to give a little story of my background, I was born in India and I immigrated to the US in the early 90s, 1990, and actually ended up knowing Asha and her family from the time I was in middle school, because we were at the temple together. And growing up, coming from about 25 generations of Hindu pujaris and priests in southern India, with a very traditional conservative family background, and growing up in the temples, I got to learn all the pujas and I got to decorate the statues, and the ritualistic embrace of it was really the heart of it for me. And as I was in my own kind of coming out process as a young teenager, I remember spending hours talking to the murtis at the temple and just really engaging in who am I, what does this mean, how do I exist, and what is wrong with me really was the question. It took me for much longer to really understand that there was nothing wrong with me, and yet I think there's a couple of strings that I want to kind of hit on in terms of how chaplaincy is so important in the spiritual context of higher education as student development, but also thinking about as South Asian immigrants' identities and all the layers that comes with that in a post 9/11 world. I was a college student when 9/11 happened, and so that has really been a significant influence in how I understand both my own Hindu-ness, but also the anti-Islamicness that's kind of embedded into what I felt like had to define Hindu-ness in the US. And that has been this really interesting tension that should not exist in my definition, and yet has been kind of transplanted from the Indian subcontinent to, I think in many ways that we show up here. And then thinking about throughout my own undergraduate studies and my graduate studies, I remember always coming back to religion as a route for understanding what was happening in the world and how I understood myself, but never having a context for why and how Hinduism specifically was my foundation. And so my whole graduate thesis in my first master's degree was how, the new Raj Yoga, what Hinduism has taught me about life, student affairs, and myself. And really exploring how do these really foundational values in the Gita think about and help me understand why and how I approach this work through my seva, through my work, through my scholarship. But still wasn't really understanding where I fit in as a genderqueer, queer immigrant, first-gen low-income brown person in the middle of Vermont at that point. And so it wasn't until I really went off to my first professional role where I started to recognize that I am that person that's supposed to fill that gap. That person that I've been looking for is within me, and that feels like it was such a Hindu moment to be like, oh, there it is. Like it is all connected, and I'm within, and to be able to have students to have conversations about how their own identity, and to be able to have the power to share my own story of how I was able to come out, where I was disowned by my community, and how I've been able to create my own sense of space and reclaiming my space in my community. I was on a panel a couple of months ago, and people were like, well, how have you created space in your community? I was like, I don't have to create space. It's always been there. My job is to reclaim that space. I believe as a queer person, as an immigrant, as a first-gen person, it is my responsibility and my right to reclaim the space within queerness, within South Asianness, within Hinduness, because it has always been there. And it is the mixing and the complicating of these identities that is how I exist, and that is the tradition and the true reality of Hinduism. I actually, talking about the book that Asha spoke about earlier today, I got to write a chapter in the book about queerness. And I was really scared when I was asked to write the chapter. I was like, what does this mean for me to verbalize and normalize my name into this topic in a space where that isn't? It's much easier for me. It feels like in a lot of queer spaces to talk about religion often, but often I find it harder in particularly Hindu spaces to talk about queerness and to be able to feel like I can be authentically myself and without fearing whether repercussions to myself or my community or my family. And yet I felt it was really important to do. And actually I got a really sweet message last week from someone that was reading the book and said, can we have a conversation? And so I had a conversation this afternoon from someone who's in their 60s, who came out 30, 40 years ago, but still was just like struggling with this identity of queerness and Hinduism. And just to be able to feel like at least like to be able to hold that space just felt powerful. And to feel like, okay, this is why we do the work. And so I'm really feeling grateful for that. What the other piece that comes to me is, as for many years, I was the director of the LGBT Center at UCLA, which being the first South Asian person at UCLA, being the first of color in that role, being the first genderqueer person, I got challenged a lot. I was often told, why are you talking about race? Why are you talking about, how are you qualified to do this work? And I think relates to what I think Varun was talking about. And yet I remember having a South Asian student who was from Karnataka, which is where my family is from, and actually a family who speaks Kannada. And so during a family weekend, she actually had her family come, and it was a Saturday. I came in and we actually had a conversation in Kannada about her queerness and about how it's okay for her to be queer, and that there's a community of her, and to be able to just share my own story with her family, and still remember being so scared about what it meant. And so I think for me, part of this chaplaincy work is beyond it's different than being a religious studies person, being a spiritual advisor. I think is that while we have to know some of the philosophical elements and the ritualistic traditions and practices that are important to the way that many Hindus understand Hinduism and Hindu practice, it is the ability to also expand our ability to say, how do we humanize the experience that students are going through and the questions that they're asking that often they're not allowed to ask in their homes, or they're told it cannot exist. And how do we make space for that in ways that feel nurturing, supportive, and actually productive to their holistic well-being as individuals, as people in larger context and community, and helping them recognize that these questions that they're asking is actually not anti-Hindu or not anti-Indian or anything else that our families tell us, but it's actually the essential, for me, the essence of what it means to be Hindu, in the ways that our spiritual leaders, whether it's Ramanuja or Shankara or anyone, has always led with asking the question is the most important part. And the beauty of Hinduism, there is not someone that's going to tell you that's the wrong answer, because every single answer that comes to you from your heart is a true answer from divinity, and so is true. And the complexity and the messiness of our practices and the messiness of multiple and contradictory beliefs is the heart of what we believe. And so I think for me, that's where I sit with and think about my own journey to why I do this work. And then the other piece I'll just mention quickly is about 12 years ago, I also started officiating weddings. And so I've done about 15 queer weddings and about 10 heterosexual but progressive weddings. And people are like, well, why do you do this? And I'm like, well, for me, it is a way for me to, again, reclaim my tradition for something that told me from the very beginning that I was not allowed to be Hindu, to actually reclaim my Hinduness, but also my ability to be a spiritual leader, which is my spiritual and familial birthright, and to actually do in a way that is modifying traditions and practices that are outdated to actually meet the needs of our communities in 2022 feels not only like an experience, an exciting opportunity, but a responsibility, because I believe that is my ability to connect my spiritual roots to the future of our communities. And so that's where I come to today. I'm excited to be here.
Thank you so much. I very much appreciate your your focus on being able to question, and I'll use that as a great seg to just remind our audience members that the chat is open, so please feel free to put your questions and comments constructively in the chat, and then there'll be the opportunity later as well to raise your virtual hand and actually ask questions with your voice. So the chat already has some questions in it, which is wonderful to see, and thank you for some very thought-provoking questions. But before we move to Q&A from the audience, I just want to introduce our moderator for this evening, who is just going to lead a brief conversation among the panelists, because we also kind of want them to exchange ideas between them. It's such a who's who today's event. We're just so blessed to have people make time for us, because our moderator is Dean Tiffany Steinwert, who is the Dean for Religious and Spiritual Life at Stanford, and she has held that position since February 2019. She previously served as Dean of Hendricks Chapel at Syracuse University, and then also as Dean for Religious and Spiritual Life at Wellesley College. Dean Steinwert brings with her experience as an ordained clergywoman, administrator, and leader in spiritual life in higher education. She holds a BA in Psychology and Women's Studies from Williams College, a Master of Divinity from Boston University School of Theology, and a PhD in Practical Theology from Boston University. I feel both coasts are really represented here. Thank you so much for making time for us today, Dean Steinwert.
I do have to say, what you left off of my bio is that I also am a fangirl of all of the people on this panel. And I'm wondering if you as the panel could talk a little bit about, like, what is that particularity? What does the particularity of being a Hindu chaplain on today's college campus mean? How is it different from being a Hindu spiritual leader, but also how is it different from being a chaplain from a different tradition? What's the nuances? What do you think is, how would you all answer that question? Asha, if you could begin, because you have you lead the Hindu Chaplains Association, and you have been doing this work for many years at Yale, and particularly thinking about through the Chaplaincy Innovation Lab, your work there, what it means to be Hindu chaplains.
Yeah, I think I alluded to this a little bit in my my earlier comments. Hindus come from such a diverse background of practices and beliefs and ways of being. I'm an anthropologist by training, so I'm very attentive to this. But I also grew up in a community that was celebrating this diversity. My parents were primary founders of the first Hindu temple in Connecticut, and that's how I met Raja, blessedly. And it was a space that attempted to be inclusive. And I see barriers, and I absolutely affirm what Raja has said about in that community being very difficult. I feel like when we are Hindu chaplains, we are able to do two things. Probably more than that, but I'll just focus on two. We're able to offer an example for students who have that heritage, that this isn't something that they have to hide, and help them navigate being Hindu in the world as it is, which is really thorny. I mean, you've heard from all of our speakers how challenging that really can be. So to have people who they can say, oh, look, there's somebody, they're on campus and they resonate with my experiences because they've had the same experiences. Like I have had the experience of feeling very alienated. I have had the Indiana and the Temple of Doom horror talks with people on the bus as a kid. I've had the Apu headache that I still have sometimes. You know, it's really difficult to break the stereotypes that are lifted in this country about South Asians, about folks from India. And also, more and more, a lot of my work is how to navigate the scriptural messages and what we face as people in the world today, because they're all scriptures are social documents, they're political documents of their time. There are nuggets of wisdom that are universals, but often, as Lastia alluded to, there's this real challenge of detangling the cultural and the spiritual. And there's this real challenge of saying, this is who I am. This is, again, for college students, identity formation is that's the focus, right? There's just so much. How can I be uniquely myself, knowing that this is what these scriptures say? How can I be uniquely myself when there are these expectations from family members, or the cultural expectations that seem to be the norm? What does a norm mean? Like, that's something that we really talk about, is how, how do we put our shoulders against the norms and say, okay, that's in the literature, that's in the vernacular, in the spaces that we're inhabiting perhaps, but how can I be my unique self and find the motivations and find the inspiration and find the awe of being spiritual in this world, right? So that perspective of being able to say, let's co-create, let's understand what these spiritual passages, these writings, these poems, these songs, what is there for you? Because maybe maybe we haven't found it yet, right? And having the ability to draw on resources from the Dharmic traditions, because I have a lot of resources. So working with students and really trying to get to know who they are, the psychological anthropologist in me, what is your worldview, right? As a Hindu, as someone from Dharmic traditions, as somebody who maybe you don't come from those traditions, but you're drawn to something, right? So it's the second part is kind of educating on a college campus what Hinduism is all about, because that can be very thorny too. And so we do, and through the Hindu Students Association, I partner with them, I partner with other groups on campus to really create conversational possibilities where we can talk through a lot of these things. So I see that. And on other college campuses, I've seen similar things, whether they start as, we want to celebrate Diwali and Holi, and then they extend, right? So it just depends on how much interface the students want, if they want to organize or not. But on the individual level, it's very much allowing for spiritual flourishing from a position where I recognize so much of what they're trying to say, because I myself have felt stifled, like my chakras are choked, right? And so I understand where they are.
I'll just add a little bit to what Asha just, I think the part of the question was around what does it mean to be kind of a Swami or Swamini versus like a non-spiritual religious leader in this type of role. I do think there's, whether it's perceived or real, a barrier when it's a spiritual leader, a religious leader. Just at least in our traditions, I think there's an homage given to religious leaders, and often there's an inability to question in the same way. Versus if it's someone that is a spiritual leader, there's an ability to actually engage in dialogue and question, which is also something that, for me, I was never taught I could do with elders, right? There's a hierarchy of tradition and respect that often, I think, evades true questioning and engaging as a young person, that I think is really critical to this type of role. And then there's also, and yet at the same time, I'll also add the two folks that I'm thinking about who are both a Swami or a Brahmachari and a Swamini are people probably are some of the most open, progressive folks that I would actually have conversations with and have had incredible spaces to challenge what it looks like to do this work. And as folks have said, this is uncharted territory for many of us. And so what does this mean? And at the same time, also, how do we utilize the concept and terminology of chaplaincy to create this space, but really break down the barrier and really break terminology down and think about how do we actually define terminology that allows us to feel not as if we're simply recreating a Christian hegemonic identity and experience of what a chaplaincy role is supposed to be, but to really meet the needs of what our community needing, and is that same or different from other contexts that are not our own, and how do we decolonize even that framework when we're often aligned with whiteness in the US, and how that plays into some of those pieces. And then the other piece I think is also that we really need to start to think about, as one of the questions that was in the group is like, I come from a Brahmin family, and I don't know about the other two, but I would guess that they do as well. So there's still very much a caste-specific experience of what Hinduism and Hinduism on college campuses looks like. And so who are we actually including when we do these celebrations? How are we even engaging in conversations about complicating what is Diwali, what is Holi, who is or is not included in those spaces? Does not mean that we cannot do them or we should do them, but even are we able to have those conversations? And then the third part is also thinking about how are we as a spiritual advising community engaging in what is happening, particularly within the South Asian continent, around the just the intense politicization of religion and the ways that Hindutva, particularly in Hindu nationalism, is influencing and impacting our parents and grandparents and communities. And I know I have lots of fights with my family about just Hindutva versus Hinduism versus terminology and community and identity and who is supposed to be where, and how do we have that when we're not on the ground, and yet it impacts us, and we have a responsibility to engage in that conversation. And so I think those are all things that as spiritual advisors we can talk about, might be much harder to do as religious advisors, which is why I think that shift is important.
I love what Raja and Asha have been talking about in terms of the importance of bringing in a Hindu worldview, honoring the traditions, and affirming whatever Hindu identity our students may be wrestling with. And my experience with chaplaincy is also as a university chaplain. So I chaplained all students, and there is a particular aspect, but there is a universal aspect. And I think, I was trained as a lawyer before I was sort of became a chaplain. And so when I came to USC and I was a chaplain and students would come to me with their issues, my first instinct would be like, all right, what's the remedy? All right, here's the problem. What's the fix? What's the fix? I was always looking for that until I realized that that's a terrible approach as a chaplain. And really what we do as chaplains is to honor people's experiences, to create space for them to share those experiences, to make sure that people are seen and heard, especially in a social media age where many of our students don't feel seen and heard, and to connect with the essential humanness of whatever they're going through. And how this plays with Hindu students is that I feel like Hindu students don't have other spaces like this. They, as Raja was saying, there's the Swami or the Guru. You may be prostrating at that person's feet. That's not the person you're having a conversation with about identity, or even things about dating or drugs versus life choices or whatever else students are wrestling with. And in our community, I don't want to be a sweeping generalization, I don't want to make sweeping generalizations here, but I have noticed, at least from my experience, our community, the Hindu American community, isn't great in terms of encouraging young people to avail themselves of mental health resources. There's still a stigma in many ways, cultural stigma, to getting that kind of care that can be life-affirming, life-saving care. So if you don't have the Guru or Swami, and if you don't have the counselor or the psychologist, and if you're in a world where you constantly feel judged by your parents and your aunties and your uncles, and your cousin is taking the MCATs at 12, like where do you go for any kind of affirmation or space? And so I think even in the core identity of a chaplain, which would be very similar across the faith traditions, being in a space with someone, honoring that experience, being there as a support resource, walking with students through triumph and tragedy. I think that the Hindu student community is in particular need of that kind of resource because of either the cultural sort of context that they may come from. I'm on a campus with 2,000 international students from India, so they have a very different experience than the so-called ABCD student like me, the American Board Confused AC. And so even within that context, coming from India, they may not have ever seen a counselor, a therapist, or a guru to talk about intimate details of their life. And so that trust is critical. When Hindu students come to a Hindu chaplain, they have that trust in a way that they might not with other chaplains or with other counselors who might not be as culturally competent. I mean, religion is a language, and once you are able to share themes of a language, then it's a different kind of conversation. When you can come to a chaplain and talk about karma, dharma, moksha, you can't talk about that with every chaplain, but you can with a Hindu chaplain. And so it's, I think, a critically important resource at an important time in a student's life.